All right, another launch week in the books. Launch week 7 is officially complete, and wanted to take a moment to just talk through the week with two of our core product team members here at Turbot. So with us is John Smith, one of our lead product architects across all things Turbot. Hey, John.
Hey, Bob.
And Cody, who's one of our core software architects across all things Turbot. And this launch week specifically led the work on Tailpipe, our new open source project. So welcome, Cody.
Yeah, thanks, Bob.
Typically for these wrap-up parties, just go through the week, talk through maybe what was interesting, a little bit behind the scenes of how or why we did some things behind those product launches. But to kick it off, Monday we launched guardrails for GitHub. And so just some background on that. It's a new scope for Turbot Guardrails where we can now detect and remediate misconfigurations on GitHub organizations and repository configurations. And so, John, I know you had some hands in that. Why GitHub? I know we've done Amazon, Azure, GCP. We did Kubernetes recently, as well as some ServiceNow work. And why is GitHub kind of the next major scope?
GitHub is probably the most common part of your software supply chain, right? Almost everybody uses GitHub in some manner of speaking. It has configuration options that leave you open to, security and compliance problems, just like any other cloud-based platform. So, it's pervasive. First of all, so many people use it. Also, well, it's a public service, so pretty easy to kind of get integrated with, and there's a lot of folks that use it. And so, it's important to make sure just simple things like that your repos are not public, that you don't want to be public. Started with some baseline controls, make sure that Dependabot alerts are on, secret scanning is on, that type of stuff. There's a whole bunch of additional controls we can pursue, if we decide to, if customers find that stuff interesting and compelling. But to some extent, it's a no-brainer. Like having eyes on the posture of your GitHub repositories is important and frankly kind of difficult right now. And I think, Guardrails makes that a lot easier.
Yeah, for sure. And even for someone like ourselves, I mean, we manage hundreds of GitHub repos. I know, Cody, you've had a hand in managing a ton of them, over the years. And we actually wrote a blog post about how to help manage, that many projects at scale and using some things with Steampipe and Turbot pipes. But what are some of your pain points? Like when you're managing those repositories, I know we do a lot of templating, but what are some core things that would be helpful in a guardrails situation being looked after at your behalf?
For our own repos, yeah, we have hundreds, and it's just really hard to manage. A lot of the issues or a lot of the pain points really come from there's just so many things that you can configure within your organization or within your repository. What makes that really difficult in particular is that GitHub has some controls that you can set at the org level and cascade down or use inheritance. But there's a lot of features that are still very much per repository, and there's no good mechanism really to do so. So overall, it's definitely a tough problem, and I think that there's a lot of value in something like guardrails coming in and being able to keep an eye on that and look out for things, correct things, kind of like we do in our own guardrails type way. Within particular organizations, repositories, usually a lot of the heavy focus is around the settings around collaborators or around who has access into your repository or your organization level. What type of access do they have? And then once even if they have some permissions, within branch protections, I think those are maybe the old classic names or the new rule sets that they have, things like that. So for people who you do allow into your repositories or to look at your code or your artifacts, what are they then able to do with that? And then having the appropriate protections, especially on key branches or the key repositories where you really want to make sure to have those locked down and make sure the wrong people aren't getting in or the right people are in, but they're only able to do what they should be doing.
From a guardrails perspective, you're the cloud team and you're looking at your entire pipeline. You're looking at things that might get introduced from the pipeline down to your cloud infrastructure. You're having one place to manage your governance controls. Whether you're just have a handful of repos or you have hundreds of repos like we do. And so I'm excited to get see what customers how they use it, how they're leveraging it. We've had some good use cases so far. So looking forward to us expanding that out because there's so many, like you're saying, there's so many configurations on the repository or the org level. And so, we're looking to expand what we currently have out there in our policy packs.
Yeah, it's a good point too, Bob. You mentioned about that, having like a single view or single pane of glass to it, where within GitHub, not that I know of at least, there's no good place to look at even for a single setting or configuration for all of your projects in a given, or all of your repositories in a given organization to view the status or even what the configurations are. So nice to have something within Guardrails to be able to view that and look for not only outstanding things, but in general, just get a nice picture of what things are enabled or how they're configured within your environment.
On Tuesday, we then announced another major Guardrails launch with support of OpenTofu as part of our stack controls. And so for those who aren't familiar, Guardrails has a concept of stacks where you can set policies. Originally with Terraform HCL, you can set as a policy that would then deploy across all of your Amazon, Azure, or Google accounts and would manage drift of those changes. And so really cool design to manage deployments at scale, mainly for the cloud team, not necessarily for developers to use as their pipeline, but more of an augmentation for the cloud team to manage landing zones and standard networking patterns, identity patterns, et cetera. This announcement was more specific about improvements to that stack, those stack controls, but also support for OpenTofu. So John, what is OpenTofu and why did we venture down that path?
OpenTofu essentially is an open source Terraform. So HashiCorp changed the licensing model of Terraform recently to a model that is not an open source or fully open source model. We are kind of pinned to an older version of Terraform in the product as a result of that. So that was the original impetus of it. But as we migrated to OpenTofu stacks, we also decided to take the opportunity to change some of our approach to improve how the stacks operate and to basically to simplify them, both architecturally and kind of from a user perspective. If you are already using the Guardrail stacks, the older Terraform stacks, the policy structure is going to look very similar. You should be able to move them over, relatively easy if you want. Previous model, we had this idea of a configured control separate from the stack control. All of the state we built dynamically from the CMD, and you had an ability to rerun a single item in the stack, and it kind of all worked that way. But part of the problem was it was really complex. As a result, we had to kind of peer inside of Terraform, and so there were some features of Terraform that we couldn't support. Like we were kind of coupled into the version of Terraform that we used. And as it made changes, it was kind of brittle because of how much we had broken into the black box for that implementation. And there were some features of Terraform that just didn't work. Like you couldn't use count and for each because of the way that we had managed those. So in the new native stacks, in addition to being open source and we can update the versions all that we want, we're also less dependent upon a specific version. So we're more abstracted from the implementation. So it should be easier in the future to continue to support changes. If you can run it in OpenTofu locally on your machine, it should run in Guardrails. That's a big deal because these, people use the stacks for all sorts of stuff. And sometimes they're quite complex. People use them for like network landing zones as an example. Those stacks can get fairly complex, and it's hard to troubleshoot them if you have to not only troubleshoot how they run locally, but then it doesn't work exactly the same way once you port it into Guardrails. That's not really the case anymore. So that's a big win for that as well. Now we still do resource triggering for drift detection. So one of the advantages of running stacks, the old ones or the new ones, is the fact that we can tell when things change and then automatically rerun the stack to keep them in compliance with your standards. The native stack Guardrails actually have two models of drift detection you can choose. So you can run it at regular intervals. If you do that, you don't actually even have to have mods for the other resources installed. So in the old model, if you had a stack, every resource that you put in the stack had to have a Guardrails equivalent installed in the installation.
Right.
We have really good coverage, so it certainly was, possible to do this. It really wasn't a problem in terms of being able to do it, but it was a requirement. So even if you never used the controls around a given resource, but you wanted to put it in a stack, you had to install that mod. And and in the new one, if you just want to do interval-based drift detection, you don't really need any of the other mods if you don't want them. Now, if you do install those other mods, you can also do resource change-based triggering. So if it detects a change to one of the resources that's managed by the stack, it will trigger the thing to run. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. So it's more options, more flexibility, and I think it really positions us well to keep moving forward with a feature that a lot of people like for a variety of cases.
Because I mean, of course, you can run OpenTofu in a lot of different ways yourselves. So like, what is the main benefit of doing it through guardrails instead of your own pipeline tools or however else that you want to manage it? So I know I think it sounds like the drift detection is one, because I would think in other tools you just kind of just rescanning and then you're catching the drift by polling. But the event-based capture is interesting, but also maybe the CMDB or the calculated policies that we can take advantage of.
One thing is we keep track of the state file for you, so you don't have to, store it somewhere and lock it and, worry about contention and stuff. That's one of the things. So it's kind of simpler to manage. The point about the contextual information is also a good point, right? So if you're a guardrails user, you probably already know about calculated policies, right? You can write a GraphQL query to get anything out of the CMDB, and then in a template, render a policy value using the data from the CMDB. And so that allows you to, look in the environment and put contextual information from the CMDB into your policy values. And certainly with stacks, that's completely a possibility. If you're running a stack in a given region, you can get all the information about the account and region that it's running in and pull that into, calculated policies if you want to. I think the CMDB is a great source of metadata. And in fact, a lot of companies pull additional stuff into the guardrails CMDB to use as metadata that you can also use in all of these stack policies as well.
I think it gets really powerful because like OpenTofu has like a direct way to get like the data provider. You can get some info, but that is kind of limited if you're trying to do like multi-queries or trying to get the other data sources that aren't part of the plugin. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean there's data providers in Terraform and OpenTofu that you can use to query for information about that is contextual information. In guardrails, we have an entire CMDB available to you that you can get things that are indirectly related, right? Not just I'm running in this region or this account, but these are the tags for this AW account from organizations that apply to the account that I'm running in, right? So the CMDB has all of this stuff. So instead of just the kind of direct information that you could get from a data provider, you can get relational information out of the CMDB and use that contextually.
Wednesday, another Guardrails announcement day. First one we did was now supporting the cloud organization layer of Amazon, Azure, and Google. So we always had the ability to connect your, let's say, Amazon accounts directly, your Azure subs or Google projects. To do that at scale, you might do it through API or you might do it through Terraform most often. In this case, we now have the ability just to connect your org or your tenant directly into Guardrails to import all of your organizational structure at once, just in a few clicks. Why is it something that we've done, I don't know, probably years later compared to, we came out with the individual accounts and we had the Terraform approach, but why come out with the org stuff now, I guess years after having these type of features?
People have asked for it in the past. The answer has usually been Terraform, and a good portion of our customers manage all of the stuff through Terraform, want that level of control. Now, you still have that capability. If you want to use Terraform and import specific accounts to specific places, you can continue to do so. From an ease of use perspective, though, it's a simpler setup, right? So you go through the process and you import the organization, one time, and it can automatically pull in all the other accounts. Now, in the case of AWS, there's a little more work because you actually have to create the accounts in every single member account just because of the way that, AWS works.
You mean the,
We
yeah,
provide a CloudFormation template that you can build a stack set with in order to, to do that. So, partially it's just easy use. The other thing is in the org import, we maintain the organization structure in the CMDB, and we'll move things around automatically as things change. So if you move a thing from one OU to the other, it'll automatically synchronize it. If you delete an account, it'll automatically get deleted and cleaned out of the system. If you add an account, it'll automatically get added. With the caveat, of course, that you won't be able to see anything until you add the role, so that we have the rights to discover the items in the account, but it automatically syncs it. In the case of like GCP and Azure, where it has actually the same security principle, we actually can automatically add and discover the things in those subscriptions and projects as they're added and removed. So, it eases the administrative burden. Now, as I said, there are some customers that would rather import their structure in a different structure than their organization structure in Guardrails, and you can continue to do that using Terraform or manually importing those accounts.
Yeah, because I believe like most organizations, at least originally, they were setting up like their Amazon org and then the OUs and the account structure, maybe based on billing or cost center reasons. But when bringing it into Guardrails, you're much more of like, policy decisions or governance controls that you might want to group through a hierarchy. And so maybe how you might build back might not be the same way that you want to group by policy, like dev environments or different business units or different application grouping is why you might want to maybe change your model within Guardrails. So I guess like from that perspective, or even just thinking of it from a multi-cloud, you may not want to just bring in your whole org as is. Like, and so having the benefit of maybe doing it per account could be beneficial because you could kind of change up the hierarchy.
Yeah, absolutely. Or if you have, a bunch of different workspaces because, you have thousands and thousands of accounts, and, you may want to arrange them in a different way. The AWS organization thing is interesting because they've added more and more capabilities to allow delegation of security things through it. I think generally the OU structures or folder structures or management group structures, depending on, what cloud provider you're talking about, their intent really is to delegate administration. In AWS, there's a billing management group thing that kind of preceded it, so it's kind of, tied into it. But in terms of the structure of those, they're intended to be delegation of administration. And so quite often you do want the same structure in Guardrails, but that's not always true. And the larger the organization and the longer they've been around, the more likely it is that there's, one-offs here and there that they want to account for. And you can, you can do that. In fact, you can do both if you want. You can import an organization and exclude specific OUs and projects or accounts or subscriptions when you do the import. And so those won't be synchronized. And you could then separately add those to a specific other folder as well. So it's quite flexible in allowing you to either mirror your organization structure or create a new one or create a hybrid approach that works for you.
The other announcement was around control muting. We've had this concept of maybe skipping controls or ignoring them or changing whether you might just want to alert on them or enforce. And we've had that functionality, but now we introduced control muting. What is that? And, how is that different than just managing exceptions?
That's a good question. There's some nuance to it. Essentially, muting is about visibility, right? Yeah. If you have an alarm and you just don't want to see that alarm, you can just mute it, right? If reducing the visibility of the stuff that you don't care about increases the visibility of the stuff that you do. And I think there's a problem just kind of throughout the whole industry. All the tools generate too many alarms, and trying to separate the signal from the noise becomes quite difficult. And so muting is a tool to help you be able to do that. Policy exception is a more general thing that allows you to override a policy setting anywhere in the hierarchy at the resource and above. right? So you can accomplish a similar thing with a policy exception to skip a control, to your point. Now, policy exceptions aren't limited to the primary policy that affects the control. A policy exception occurs in the policy hierarchy. A mute mutes a control, which is a subtle distinction. But here's the reason why it's important. There's times when you want to do a policy exception that changes the behavior of a control. It still runs, but with different values. You can do that with a policy exception. When you mute, you don't change the policy structure at all. You don't change your posture. You just tell it to shut up. The difference is partially in that it's still evaluated. It only affects the primary control as well. If you mute a control, you can still see, I don't want to say hidden by default, but it's not returned in the normal place you would see it based on its alarm status, right? But you can still get to it and see its current status because the control still runs. So if a thing is in alarm and then you mute it, you won't see it when you list the alarms unless you say, and the muted. But when you see it, you'll see it's muted, oh, and it's in alarm. And in fact, if it's muted and it goes to okay, it'll get updated and you can say, oh, it's muted, but it's okay. In the case of an exception to skip, it's always skipped. It won't run at all. So you don't really know from guardrails what the status of the thing is in the way that the mute does. An ease of use feature of the muting stuff is that, it's right on the control. You just say mute this thing, and it's really intended to be on a per instance basis. I know this thing is not in compliance and I can mute it. And a thing that we added is the ability for you to tell it to unmute based on the state. So as far as policy exceptions go and muting goes, you can do them permanently or indefinitely, I should say. But you can also say for a period of time, which is useful, right? Somebody has something that's out of compliance and you tell them, you got 30 days. Boom, you can mute it for 30 days. Or you can skip it for 30 days. But in muting, you could also say, actually, unmute it once it's okay, right? So if they fix it earlier, now it's being monitored right away. It shows up, how you want it to do. So there's a little more flexibility in some of the muting stuff.
Yeah, I definitely see so the policy exceptions are kind of before, or you're changing your posture, and that policy exception is before the control runs. After the control is run, you're muting. And it's more of like suppressing the alert, or we can call it the shut up the alert, like you said. Well, we should update that in the product. So, okay, yeah, so exceptions, muting, seems like it'd be easier for folks. Is there like a very common use case that one might use, like that we've seen with our customers? Like why muting would be like the go-to?
I mean, I would generally mute a thing if I'm aware that it has some exception that I don't want to address. I would use a policy exception if I'm specifically okay with the setting, which is subtly different, right? I would also use a policy exception if I want to change the behavior of the control so that it is okay. So here's an example, right? In the case of S3 default encryption, there's a control for that, and you can choose the level of encryption, right? If, at the account level, let's say, you have set this to be customer managed key, and then you have a bucket that doesn't have that, but it has encryption. It's just that it's only SSE, let's say. You can create an exception for this one that says this needs to be SSE or higher, right? Now it goes into an okay state, right? Because you've said this one's okay to be at SSE, and it still checks a level. It just doesn't check the one that you had set at the top level, right? If it's, this one, the encryption's not right. Somebody needs to go fix this. I'm gonna give them a couple weeks to fix it because I know about it. Then I would just mute it for 2 weeks so that it pops back up in 2 weeks and I can see this thing still needs to be fixed.
The last announcement we had on Wednesday for guardrails was around cloud activity tracking. And so this feature is mainly around having more dashboards to help aggregate some of the activity notifications that we had built into guardrails. So for example, we have all the resource tracking, all the configuration drift as things get created, updated, deleted. Those are all events that guardrails receives. It then analyzes that change and it then triggers controls if you have them enabled. But all of that is information that's been in our activity or audit trail. And so the new dashboards are then bringing that up to light to show like actions over time. And then we also do this for controls and then also for resource changes. What is the most helpful? Like, so we've had all this information in the product. I guess it's mainly been in table views or list views, which you can query, visualize in the console. You can also stream it out to sim tools. But what are these dashboards like? Why are they helpful? And what kind of visibility are you getting out of them to show that over time?
I mean, the over time is the thing. It's a trend over time of things in aggregate that makes it easier to see what Guardrails is doing, how your posture has changed, how your environment potentially has changed. So, it's a graphical view that you can pretty quickly see, the resources that have changed over time. Oh, wow, there's a spike in resources. What's this about? What you can see the data that occurred, et cetera. Or you can see the number of controls by status. So all of a sudden, maybe your controls, there's more alarms than there were before, or maybe there's less because, something was fixed. So it allows you, it's the 30,000-foot view over time of the environment that helps you, view what's happening, make operational decisions, and see also kind of the impact of your decisions and your posture over time.
I know we've had some customers, starting to use it. We've got some great use cases so far, but just in your opinion, because you were an owner of a cloud team in the past, and also using Guardrails yourself. But like, with if you had this in your hands, when you were a Guardrails customer, what's the biggest insights that you would be looking for? Maybe an example or situation that would have been helpful if you had this.
Seeing the control status over time is one of the big ones, and that helps not just for awareness, but also for reporting, letting people know, proving that you're making progress, seeing your progress over time, being able to gauge that. I think, that's one of the key things. We talk about like a specific case. It's kind of hard to tell because these dashboards generally lead you to where issues are, right? They don't necessarily just pointed out, but they provide enough information for you to decide to dig in and see, hey, why all of a sudden is there so many new resources, right? Maybe you're spending a bunch of money because things are being, created that you weren't aware of, and you can see it pretty quickly in the graph, but you still have to go investigate it. And that's, that kind of big picture view is helpful.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
as far as like a specific thing, I think the cases that the customers have found are more compelling because they have found insights, from looking at those.
yeah, I mean, just on the actions or the activity, just seeing a spike in resources, commonly it might be a bug in your app or a bug in your auto scaling that's causing like this spike. And so when you could see that on a trend line, it's like, oh, wait, that doesn't look normal. Or the amount of resources that have changed might be some gap, I guess, maybe from like your pipeline, maybe automating something, but then Guardrails is coming and fixing it in runtime. You might see kind of a spike in updates that might not be normal baseline on that account. So I definitely could see like the activities, and I guess the controls, to your point, you probably want to see a burn down of, hey, my alerts were X, last month, and now they're burning down over time.
Yeah.
And I guess coming down to like the value of the cloud team is trying to basically control the environment, govern it, but also bring down the noise.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. You want to see them burn down over time. Actually, I think you kind of want to see a stair step, right? Because you want to see them burn down, and then you want to add more. Then you want to evaluate more things, which maybe you turn on some more things, and then there's some more alarms, and then you address those, so that you're constantly, finding new things and then approving those, and that can become apparent in the graphs.
Yeah, excited for that to come out. I know there'll be more and more, kind of dashboards and different things that we'll be adding in. So yeah, excited to see that come through. Now Thursday, big announcement, new open source project, Tailpipe. Yeah, super excited about this one. It gives me Steampipe vibes, the simplicity of it, the kind of ease of use to basically collect and then query with SQL your logs locally right in your terminal. It's really powerful. And I know, like, we'll get into, there's a lot of different topics here, but one thing that struck me was kind of the speed and the scale locally. So like, Cody, I think that was something that you had mentioned to me before. It's just how impressed we were with just the sheer scale that you can manage with this. How does that actually work with Tailpipe? And why are we seeing those type of performance metrics locally on your machine?
Yeah, so there's a couple things at play here that really help us scale. And when we had started, we had visions of how many rows, or how many log entries we could capture and what type of log entries and whatnot. And as we really started to get into it, and one type of log that we focused on was CloudTrail logs. We really started to dig in and pull out our own CloudTrail log data down from our S3 buckets and just start to process it. We just got to a point where at some point I think I was pulling down over 100 million rows or 100 million log entries, kind of going to the tables there. And that just was really amazing in terms of how many logs we were able to really capture, pull down, and store locally. But then on top of that, the actual performance and how quick it was to actually query all of that data and just really run through it using familiar SQL queries. Behind a lot of that, in order to make that work, the way there's a couple parts to it in terms of how we can go out to an S3 bucket or a different source and kind of pull down the log files there. We've done a lot of optimization and just really trying to really understand how best we could pull that down and handle the different artifacts or files as they're downloaded. But I think a lot of it really is coming from how we ultimately store all of those files, and then actually how we partition a bunch of it. So a lot of the driver behind our ability to process this many, collect and then actually query and process many files is we really lean into DuckDB. I think overall we really liked what they were doing and kind of how they were able to handle files, and then within the file structure and using different Hive partitioning within all, and kind of combining all of that to really think about how do we want to collect these logs and then partition them, and really lean into DuckDB's type of capabilities in order to make sure that when we're running a query that we're doing it in the most optimized way possible. So we're able to not only store them in these Parquet files, compact them down to get to a reasonable size, even for 130 million rows or log entries that I'm capturing from one or more accounts. And then when I'm querying, getting results sometimes in 1 to 2 seconds across that 130 million rows total, even if I get 1,000, 10,000, 50,000, however many rows based on my query that I'm pulling out, that whole high partitioning and the Parquet files, all that together, I think works really well to give a really scalable solution for someone who wants to go and download a ton of logs and then query that in real time, not real time, but be able to query that locally and get results really quickly.
Why would you want to pull the logs locally? I mean, typically, just kind of more of an outsider in this, there's all these log management tools that are out there. Typically you're streaming your logs or collecting them, moving them to some type of SIEM or SIM type tool to then do the analysis on them. Who would want to pull them locally, and like why would you do that versus using your logging tool?
Yeah. So I'll key up John to, I'm sure he has some other thoughts on this, but for me, what I found really compelling and why I would want to pull it down locally is, for me, the main reason came down to it was just so easy. Really that ease of use, that kind of just taking down as many barriers of entry as possible to be able to start to look at my log data. When you look at things like CloudTrail logs or Azure Activity logs, there are ways that you can go into the AWS or Azure console and start to look at those and peruse those. And then there's other common solutions even within the cloud providers like AWS and running Athena queries and things like that over that once you have them collected. But all of that required some inherent knowledge, some extra configuration. And then there are other log tools out there too that are great at what they do. But even there's some setup, and that ingestion or them pulling those logs takes time, and there's extra setup that's really required, I think, from a user's perspective, just to get running and just to run a query, like how many log entries do I have, or if I want to look for a certain event or from a particular user or actor, how do I get to that point as quickly as possible? So for me, the process of why I would want to collect it locally and why I find Tailpipe really compelling is the ability to just download the Tailpipe CLI, set up a small partition, and then run a collect command. And then again, relatively fast based on, even if you're pulling down 100+ million rows, And then as soon as that's done, I can instantly start running SQL queries against all that data that I've collected locally. And all that process, is I feel is pretty fast compared to trying to do it my own way or through AWS's tooling, for instance, that way. So it's really the speed of being able to pull that down locally and not have to ingest it into another tool necessarily in order to start interacting with it.
Yeah, it almost feels Steampipe-esque in a
Mm.
way, like where it's just like, query the APIs live, not go
Mhm.
through the whole ETL type of process. And here you got to run a collection command, it sounds like, and then you can query it. But see
Mhm.
the speed of doing so. I mean, these are CLI commands. They're not some scripting you had to do, or it's not some massive ETL flow into the sim. So it's more localized. It seems like it scales. What'd you say? Hundreds of millions of
I
rows?
think I capped out. I could have went higher. I think I capped out at around 130 million CloudTrail log entries / rows within the
Very good
table.
for your testing. Yeah.
Yes.
I know there was a number of queries that you ran, and and some of the stuff we're bringing into our SRE processes. What were some of the more like interesting queries that you ran, or just investigation, like just playing with it? Like what was fun about it, and then what was interesting as you were kind of running queries and finding things out in the logs?
Yeah, a couple come to mind. So just I was getting to that and just learning, how do people query logs or what can you do with it once you really have it in hand? And again, can use familiar SQL syntax in order to get that out. The first one I ran was, I think I was looking at where I had the 100 plus million rows, and I thought, well, how many of these are actually actions or events that actually change something in the account? So within CloudTrail logs, there's a read-only field that you can query against, and that's also in the table. So I just did a query. I think it's select count star from AWS CloudTrail log. We're not read only. And there, what I found was, I think it was under a million. It was like maybe 3 to 4% of the total logs, or somewhere around there, were actually not only non-read only events. So a majority of the activity from the accounts for the logs I had collected, 90, 95+% of it was just read only, which might be valuable in some cases, but in particular cases where you're looking for potentially malicious actions or you're looking for changes across your accounts, even just taking that knowledge and going, well, when I collect my logs, what happens if I filter out the read only? The amount of storage space it took up locally on my disk, that also dropped, I think 90, 95% roughly there too. So
Mhm.
overall, the collection really was sped up. The querying process was also even faster than it was before, and I knew that I was working with a much smaller data set, but more focused based on just how my logs looked and what the shape of them were.
Being able to play with the data and then
Mm,
getting insights out of it, then you get learning more about your environment as you go.
mm,
It's very exploratory. It's almost like you're interrogating the environment in a friendly way. But yeah, I mean, I got a lot of that type of experience with steam pipes, so definitely excited to do that from the log component standpoint, especially bringing some of that,
mm,
some of the work that we've done with logs for our SOC 2 process. Looking forward to
mm.
bringing that in with Tailpipe and making that a bit easier and streamlined. I know there was a lot that we wanted to do with Tailpipe, and at some point we got to cut the line and release version 0.1. Was there certain features or certain scope that we had to cut or that we're looking forward to adding next? Any insights to where we might be heading with Tailpipe, I guess, in the immediate near future.
Yeah, I'll bring up two, and then John, if there's any you want to cover as well, feel free to jump in at any point. The first one was just, I think, for us that we wanted to come out with and are still and are, going to do really soon after as a fast follow. A lot of it's around the scope and the coverage of just the different plugins, and then the Powerpipe mods that we have as well. So I think at launch today we cover a lot of the key ones like AWS CloudTrail logs, GCP audit logs, Azure activity logs. So a lot of the major key cloud players taking a look at their audit logs and being able to have plugins with really hopefully helpful documentation in addition to the Powerpipe detection mods where you can run pre-built dashboards and detections against all the logs that you collected. But there's so many other log types out there that we really want to be able to capture and create all of those dashboards and detections for as well. Things like you guys were talking about earlier, like all the GitHub audit logs, being able to pull that out and be able to inspect those and run queries, Okta, authentication type things, Okta, Auth0, looking out at other like Google Workspace or Microsoft Entra ID, there's probably hundreds of other different additional log types or log sources that we can really think about and bring into the product and really just expand to the scope that we kind of have, I think, in Steampipe plugins today, and the
Right.
corresponding PowerPipe mods is there. So really hoping that we can just keep building on that more and more. The other related to tables, the other feature that we're looking to get out as quickly as we can is the ability to work with what we're calling dynamic tables. So for I mentioned we have tables for Cloudtrail logs and Azure Activity logs, and the nice thing about those is we have a pre-built schema and we have sources that work really well with those. So in general, as a user, you don't really have to do any configuration. You just have to point Tailpipe where to go, and it can start to collect and automatically generate the schema and has the right columns and whatnot in place. But really with these dynamic tables / custom logs, the idea was that we would really want to offer this flexible capability where no matter what type of log that you have in whatever type of format, whether it's maybe a JSON format or it's different lines, can't remember what that format's called, but being able to just have your own custom format and then being able to tell Tailpipe how to parse that. Tailpipe will then be able to ingest or collect those logs, try its best to actually take all of that schema information, that format information you gave it, and automatically generate a schema for you too on the fly. So as a user, the goal, or as from a product perspective, the goal would be how can we make it as easy as possible for users to not only collect really well-known logs or very well-supported logs, but even if they have their fully owned custom logging format that they use, how can we make it as easy as possible to get those logs into Tailpipe and then be able to query them and interact with dashboards and detections as well?
Yeah, it sounds like which I guess is going to be highly needed because there's probably infinite number of custom log outputs and formats, etc. It kind of sounds like the dynamic tables in Steampipe, where like in Kubernetes you can have those like custom resource definitions or tables, and so like we're able to kind of expand by just reading it and then dynamically creating that table. I know we do a number of that in like in ServiceNow and other plugins. So that extensibility, like or more automated or more assisted extensibility, definitely go a long way, especially in the log management area.
Just to tack on there too, you asked the question earlier about why local when talking about Tailpipe, but
Yeah,
that's not the only reason why you would run Tailpipe, right? That the fact that it's open source means that if we don't support a log, you can. You can contribute to our plugins. You can write your own plugins. We do want to make it easier to just dynamically support common formats that, so that you can create your own JSON, CSV log file parsing without having to write a plugin. But the fact is, it's all open source, so you can write your own if we don't support it. Additionally, it all plugs into our framework, right? So you can use PowerPipe to do all of these detections through all these various file types. It's just SQL. It kind of fits into the kind of the rest of this kind of pipes ecosystem in a way where I think you really get the benefit of all of it kind of together. If you use Tailpipe, you can plug other things right into it. You can query it directly using SQL. You don't have to learn Splunk's language or something else. You can get started really easily, and it doesn't cost you anything. Like one of the reasons why local is because it doesn't cost you anything. You don't have to run Snowflake in order to run it, for instance. It's easy to get started, and it's easy to kind of build incrementally from there. So we as we go to add features and we go to add platforms, the fact that it's open means we isn't limited to the folks at Turbot, but to the community as a whole, which has been really powerful with our other stuff. And, hopefully a lot of people do contribute, whether it's code or issues or ideas or suggestions.
Community is such a huge factor in, why we did these projects, how those projects have been growing and supported, the use cases that they've extended to. So yeah, I'm super interested to see how our community uses Tailpipe. And with that, I mean, this is becoming a collection of open source projects. So, Steampipe, PowerPipe, FlowPipe, and now Tailpipe. But there's a lot of synergy in between them. And I know we kind of group that and bring it into Turbot pipes to bring that integrated story. But even just from the open source side of things, it seems like those detection mods are kind of the first Tailpipe plus another open source project together. What are detection mods that we came out with in PowerPipe? How does that work with Tailpipe? And what are some of like the key benchmarks that folks can use?
So the detection mods, like you mentioned, that we've come out with at the moment, we have one for the AWS, Azure, and GCP plugin, and for the log, that we've come out with for those plugins. Yeah, within these mods, the goal was to create them and have a set of pre-built dashboards and detections that people could run right out of the box. So of course, when you're using Tailpipe and you're collecting your log data, you can query it, write your own set of queries. We have hundreds of example queries on the Tailpipe hub as well across the tables that you can copy paste right in and use against your own log data to get different insights as well. But with these with these PowerPipe, detection mods, two main benefits that PowerPipe kind of brings. The first is that visualization layer. So being able to take that Tailpipe data and then being able to get some out of the box visualizations / ones that you can extend as well. Like John had mentioned, all the PowerPipe detection mods, those are also open source as well. So you can take a look at those / create your own mods as well. But I think that visualization layer on top is really powerful. I think for me, it really kind of brought my log data to life in a way where the queries and the table results I would get were interesting. But once I could start to see what were trends across certain dates, or what were trends, how were my logs divided up across accounts, or if I wanted to, for instance, get maybe my top 10 activities or top 10 source IPs, I can start to visualize that, and it really helped me understand my log data better from an overview perspective and from a shape perspective as well. In addition to the dashboards, though, like you mentioned, Bob, we also do have a set of detections. So for those who are familiar with our other Steampipe PowerPipe mods, where we have benchmarks with controls that you can run to look for security or compliance issues, detections are similar in a way to controls in that you can write detections within PowerPipe mods, and then you can add them to benchmarks. And what these detections really help you do as a user with your log data, help you find patterns or suspicious activity among your log data. So these detections have kind of pre-built queries that come alongside them, and they're meant to help you find these rows that might lead to suspicious activity, or might help you want to investigate your activity within the account more. So maybe to help with that, a concrete example is we have one detection where in particular it looked for root user logins into the AWS console. So in general, root user login / activity, really not recommended. This is really kind of a break glass type thing, but a lot of people see it in their environments, or maybe they don't know that it's happening. It's a bit hard to tell unless you're looking for that specifically in the CloudTrail logs every day yourself. So with this detection, what I'm able to do is once I collect my Tailpipe log data, what I can do is I can go ahead and run that particular detection, or run it as a dashboard within the PowerPipe UI. And then immediately I can start to see all the rows, all the events that correspond to that particular detection that I'm looking for. So immediately I can see, every time someone logged in as root, I can see what time that was. I can see what the originating source IP address was, what the user agent was. I can get, there's additional, was MFA used? Anything that the CloudTrail log data has, I'm able to then immediately see within my detection result within the terminal or within the UI. And then on top of that, I can then start to filter through. Within the PowerPipe UI, we've added some new capabilities as well to help you do per row filtering within a set of detection results. So for instance, if I see, I know that a particular source IP belongs to a certain user and that's approved usage, I can actually filter out those rows from what I'm seeing on the screen, which will then help me just really drill down into what's important from there.
That filtering out the per row and then being able to group, and then there's some new visual dashboarding tooling that we have. It seems like it's going to be really powerful for folks to kind of still continue to build and extend. I feel like those detection mods, like as you're going through that and you're filtering, does it help then lead you to, well, I got to try out a new Tailpipe query, or I want to now add a detection? that's just going to make this, I don't have to filter and group, in the future. It's just going to be a very specific detection. Do you see that as like a pattern for folks to kind of just keep building on the benchmark with more detections?
Yeah, I think so. I think whether it's a new detection or a new dashboard or just a new query, I think that it definitely the detections are, I think, in a way are a good starting point to understanding the activity or looking for certain things in your account. But like that root user login, immediately when you see root logins, usually the next question I think is, well, once you're logged in, what are people doing? What
Right.
once they're in the console as root, what are they doing? So in the AWS Cloudtrail log detection mod, we actually also have a root report where you can go and look at all the root, all the actions taken by a root user. But if I didn't have that report or didn't want to run that, I could also just, like you mentioned, run a tailpipe query and just look or run my own detection and look for any action taken by a root user around that time or looking for actions for a particular service, and then really start to drill down and just learn more about what was happening during that particular time or around or for that given context.
Some of those detection mods are, I guess, just common best practices for, different rules, like, looking at root login would be, a common one. But then there was also, I guess, these MITRE ATT&CK benchmark.
Mm-hmm.
So what are those, and like why have those type of benchmarks versus the ones that are much more like agnostic?
Yeah. So I think to that last thing, we end up having both in a way. So we have a set of generic benchmarks slash organization. So for instance, in the AWS cultural detection log detection mod, we do have kind of that generic set of detections, and there we chose to group them by service just for easier findability. But like you mentioned, we also have another benchmark alongside of it for the MITRE ATT&CK v16.1, I believe it is. And there, that's not necessarily meant to replace that other per service benchmark or organization that we have. It's meant to sit alongside it. And particularly for those who are interested or use the MITRE or follow the MITRE ATT&CK framework today, that's kind of just another view into that set of detections. So the same set of detections that we use in other benchmarks, what we've done is taken those and mapping those into the MITRE ATT&CK tactic and technique structure. So according to their guidance and according to what they have in their guidelines, we've taken our detections or created new detections that we then map out to a particular set of tactics and techniques that way. So if you want to look through the lens of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, because that's what you follow, or you really like how they give guidance on what you should be looking for within a given account or subscription or whatever it is, you could just run the MITRE ATT&CK benchmark as a whole and then see all your results across the sets of tactics and techniques that they have.
I guess, looking at logs, you'd be from an ops standpoint, you might be looking at it from like an SRE. What are the common patterns that you might be looking for from an ops, versus security in these?
Got it. I think I don't know if this exactly meets the criteria, but from a detection perspective or even example queries, a lot of what we have is also around just looking for certain types of activity, not from a security perspective, but just for even to understand, for instance, any ongoing changes to networking components or just looking at how are certain authentication methods or users or roles or whatever the entity is, are how are they being used. We have detections there that can just help you track that over time and just see what are people doing. And again, it's not, like you mentioned, it's not necessarily from a security perspective as networking changes happen or the infrastructure around it is being updated or things are being attached or detached or whatever it is. So for there, I think it's helpful to get a snapshot or a picture of what do my networking infrastructure changes look like across this time period, or for these particular resource types, what are the changes ongoing, to get a better idea of just being able to really understand better what has happened in your account or what are the common patterns from there, which I then help give you a broader picture of maybe how that networking infrastructure is being managed.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. Anything you would query your logs for, you can look in there, and right. So,
Yeah.
operational trending data is in
Mm,
there, right? So it's not necessarily a security detection, but you can create dashboards to look at the number of events over time, or
mm,
query CloudTrail events and see, what's the most common event, right? To look for specific write events versus read events, or see the number of events over time, or at a given time of day, like any sort of operational metrics that you would want to do about what's happening in your environment should be in there. Another one that we haven't really done much exploration yet is, cost data that's time-based, like your spend
Mm.
over time, looking at, things like the AWS billing data and stuff. We don't have anything for that yet, but it's in the roadmap to, investigate that kind of spend type of data as well in their FinOps data. Essentially, the Tailpipe stuff is log data, which means it's time-based. And so if it's a time-based event type of a thing, then you can query it for security events, just statistical analysis of the types of things that are occurring, specific errors. You could use it to find errors, like you could grep
Mm.
for errors in a certain field and count the errors over time, or look for a specific error, or in addition to like I said, things like the financial stuff, which I think is an interesting case that we just haven't had an opportunity to get into very deeply yet.
Yeah, I was just going to say that those bills are also massive, and so I remember trying to download them on my work laptop back in the day, and it just like would crash. Excel. I had no good way of viewing them, and this before like Amazon had like a cost explorer, but even that cost
Yeah.
explorer paying per query, right? So what's a good
That's
way to
exactly
ingest
right.
your log or your billing data? Terabytes of
Yeah,
info.
you got the whole kind of observer paradox there, right? Like every time you make a query to Cost Explorer, you're actually changing your cost because it costs a penny for
Yeah.
every page that you return.
Go off what John was saying. I think one example you gave, John, was around looking at error codes or error frequency. Just to go back to when we started talking about Tailpipe, and we pulled in 100 plus million rows. I think one query that we started to run early was, what are the error codes look like? How many do we have? What's the error frequency? And I think one thing that we found was, I think what you found, we had out of those 100 plus million rows over X months, I think we had like 100,000 plus errors of like resource not found or something like that. So, like you mentioned, Bob, it's not necessarily a security thing, but I think what it means is that somewhere in one of our scripts, or in one of our automations somewhere, we have something wired up where it's looking for something, or it's trying to perform some operation against a resource that's just not quite there. And I think we probably need to go back and take a look and figure out what that is, and figure out how do we improve that, and ultimately just cut down on the churn there that we have, and just wasted API calls and wasted processing time that we're doing in order to do these kind of automations, workflow, whatever it might be, that kind of calling this and causing the errors continuously. Something else interesting, right? I never would have thought to really look for that before, even just looking through the CloudTrail log console myself, because it's really not that easy and it's hard to aggregate. But with SQL, it's actually so easy to kind of get that high level or trending information that way. And I think it really does lead to some valuable insights or actions from there. So just something cool that we kind of found along the way, and a bit surprising. But realistically, we've never really looked at that before. So maybe it shouldn't be that surprising.
And maybe I'll end with this question around Tailpipe, but looking at Tailpipe plus PowerPipe add a lot of value. Where do you guys see Tailpipe plus Steampipe, or Tailpipe plus Flowpipe, or some intermix of combinations there?
Like,
Yeah,
these products are meant to be used together, right? So the using PowerPipe with Tailpipe is super simple, and in fact, from the time you get started collecting logs to finding insightful information is minutes, right? You can download Tailpipe. It's you just basically curl install the thing, and then you can run it. You could collect some logs. There's minimal setup to start, collecting some logs. Then if you download PowerPipe, if you don't already have it, and you install a mod that uses that log file, you're instantly getting visualization of this data that you just collected. It's super fast, and it just like Steampipe. Tailpipe and Steampipe are both relational databases that you can query with SQL. There are plans to make it easier for you to query one from the other. I mean, you can't do it today, but the ability to join the information from Steampipe with the information with Tailpipe and query that information together, that's in the roadmap, that's in the plans. Flowpipe is the thing that lets you take action when you find a thing, right? So just like Steampipe could find compliance projects you could use Flowpipe to call Steampipe to look for a misconfiguration and then remediate it. Likewise, you could find things in the logs and then take action with those, whether it's just notifying people, sending alerts to people, sending Slack messages, etc., or whether it's actually changing something in the environment to remediate an issue. All that stuff is possible today. Like you can connect Flowpipe. Flowpipe can query Tailpipe just as it can query Steampipe today. So they're meant to be used together and to work together.
Well, that was, I mean, a heap of stuff that got announced this week from Guardrails and Tailpipe, and there's a bunch of other things that made it into our B-Sides post. So definitely encourage folks to check that out, because there's been a number of new Steampipe tables that were introduced. There's new PowerPipe benchmarks and dashboards to new pipes features. So definitely a bunch of other things we could talk about, but we'll break it here. I really appreciate your time and your support during launch week, and look forward to working with you guys on the next one. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks a lot, Bob.